everyone. My name is Katrina and welcome to Camouflage, from nature to military to fashion talk by Barb Hunt. The Manitoba Arts Council was founded in 1978 as Manitoba's only not-for-profit arts organization dedicated exclusively to contemporary craft. We are gathered here today in what we now know as Manitoba, the ancestral heritage of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, Dene, Inishitiwak, Dakota Wayate, Dusulane, Nehatuak, Inuit peoples, and the national homeland of the Red River Métis. These lands include territory subjects to treaties 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 10. Craft occupies a space that has its hand at the handmade at its center. It rejoices in sharing knowledge and solving problems. It stems from, creates, and nurtures empathy. It allows us to build bridges through shared action, but also fosters courage, empathy, and connection. We acknowledge the deep harm caused by settlement, and we look forward to using craft in our efforts towards reconciliation and positive change. Join me in welcoming Barb today. Barb Hunt has a diploma in art from the University of Manitoba and an MFA with a specialization in Fibres from Concordia University. Her work has been exhibited internationally and across Canada, and most recently at the Canadian War Museum. She has been awarded Canada Council for the Arts grants and artist residencies in Canada, France, and Ireland. She taught visual arts for over 20 years at Western University, Queen's University, and Memorial University of Newfoundland, where she was the recipient of the President's Award for Research. For people who just came in, there's probably some schools kind of like back there on that side. And stop by our raffle table on your way out to support the Manitoba Arts Council and win one of $3,000 value prizes for you and a friend. Anyway, I'm going to give it over to Barb.
Okay, this is my grandfather, Standish Leslie Hunt, who fought in the trenches of World War I, wearing the brown uniform of the time. He fought at Passchendaele, Ypres, and the Spring Offensive of 1918. He wrote that he survived because he was a machine gunner. I brought him because I knew I would cry. This absolutely breaks my heart that my grandfather had to kill people to survive. This is something I didn't always know. It's something that I learned not that long ago. So it's still quite upsetting. I have a war story about him, just a little one. One night he was lost in no man's land. He was wandering towards enemy lines when an Indigenous Canadian soldier found him and brought him back safely. So I'm in Winnipeg now, and I want to thank whoever that was. I don't know if they're still around. You never know. It could have been a Manitoba person. I tried to find them, but I'll keep trying. After the war, he married my grandmother, a nurse, and he never spoke about his experiences. My father was a radio operator in the Merchant Marine in World War II, which is why I use Morse code in my work, in the piece on the wall there. After the war, he also married a nurse, but none of us kids are nurses. We know too much about what's involved. Forget it. This is Edward Lemoyne, Dana Kletke's great uncle, and Dana was my collaborator on the little baby slippers. He was a Canadian soldier who drove a tank truck in World War II. After the war, he stayed in England, and along with his wife, they earned a living by making baby slippers from decommissioned parachute silk. My family lived in the United States during the Vietnam War, and this is my first boyfriend, Ricky Hillemeyer. So cute. I'm still in love with him. His brother was fighting in Vietnam, and his parents had a map on the fridge with a red ribbon that followed his movements through Vietnam. Ricky was determined to sign up the day he turned 18 and go and fight with his brother, which is how the Army gets you. It's like you're not fighting for your country, you're fighting for that man right next to you. Or woman. We moved back to Canada, maybe because of the war. I have 3 brothers. Canadians were drafted later on in the war. So Ricky and I lost touch. And as the years went by, I just couldn't bear thinking about anything happening to him. Finally, decades later, I called Ricky to see what happened, and he did enlist the day he turned 18. Then, when he was stationed in Alaska, ready to fly to Vietnam, he told me that they canceled the war, like it was a TV show. Okay, on a more prosaic level, I just love textile patterns. I worked as a freelance textile painter and designer in Montreal to support myself during and after my MFA. I appreciate camouflage patterns for their aesthetic beauty, and I'm interested in how patterns can hold meaning. Let's start with the idea of an army. We take standing armies for granted, but they are a relatively recent invention. There were standing armies in ancient times, but standing armies as we know them now are fairly recent, going back to starting in the 1400s. Previously, when a king or a leader wanted to go to war, they would just round up the local guys, give them weapons, and send them off to fight, with women and children trailing behind. They need somebody to cook. This is a figurine of a medieval Ukrainian farmer soldier. Afterwards, the farmer soldiers returned home to resume their regular life, and generally, there was no war during planting or harvesting. They knew better than to destroy their food crops. These are Australian peacekeepers in a frog skin pattern. Why do soldiers wear camouflage uniforms? The uniform camouflages personal identity, and the soldier merges with a group. It's a morale booster, and memory and nostalgia can play a role. It's a recruiting tool showing the grandeur of being a soldier, and that goes back centuries, you know, the brass buttons. Oh, I'm in the button club, I got brass buttons. I'm sorry, Button Club, there's only 2 buttons in the show, they're on the little slippers, but they are vintage. Oh, yes. Okay, where am I? I lost my place because I started thinking about buttons. Oh yes, it is the statement of national identity and creates national pride. On a practical level, it differentiates soldiers from the enemy. More philosophically, it conceals the vulnerable body underneath, providing insulation against reality. The reality is that our bodies are so terribly fragile. Camouflage changes how the soldier is seen or not seen, but it also changes how the soldier feels about him or herself. There's a feeling of magic, of transformation into something different, more powerful, closer to nature. And it's not by chance that a lot of these patterns are named after animals. This one is the frog skin, not a scary animal. These are 2 soldiers in Burkina Faso, which used to be Haute-Volta, a French colony. Each new nation creates a unique camouflage pattern as a step towards independence, as important as creating their own flag. So obviously orange camouflage isn't really camouflage, it's more about national pride and beauty, says Barb. There are over 350 camouflage patterns in the world. And something to think about. The military itself is camouflaged. Army bases are closed locations. Civilians disappear into the military. Military bases have their own police, hospitals, churches, etc. This is Anna Tuyanova, second from the left. and other women soldiers in Ukraine in 2020. From my research, I found out that no single factor predicts women's involvement in warfare. It depends on multiple factors. It appears the more that men engage in war, the lower women's status falls in that society. Young boys are more rough and tumble than girls. I don't know if this is true, but it's what I read. But after this stage, aggressiveness varies considerably from one culture to another, so much so that it is now believed that culture is more predictive of aggression than gender. So, not biology. Studies in the United Kingdom show that with only 6 months of training, women can be equal to men in physical skills necessary for infantry service. Who invented camouflage? This is a green man on the ceiling of a cathedral in England, surrounded by foliage, and he's a familiar icon in Europe. They were considered savage, primitive figures in medieval folklore. I think they represent, this is just me, my own idea, I think they represent hunters who hid by attaching foliage to themselves. So the first camouflage was a kind of merging with nature itself. The first use of unintentional camouflage was by an army in 1566 when Queen Elizabeth I sent English soldiers to Ireland in a sad green color. And sad, for those people who know dyeing, you know that means you reduce the intensity of the color, which I think does make it look sad. It's theorized, so that's that guy in the green vest over there, that infantry soldier. It's theorized that putting infantry in green comes from Germany with their strong hunting tradition. These are Scottish Black Watch Grenadiers wearing British redcoats. The white X is a perfect target. And note the green feather in their shakos, their hats. There's a little green, like that little thing up there. It's a little green feather off to the side. That's it's a vestige from the hunting origin of soldiers and camouflage. In the 18th century, firearms improved, so the enemy was engaged at a greater distance, and guns didn't emit that little puff of smoke because somebody had invented smokeless gunpowder, so it became really important not to be seen. Colonialist armies could wear bright-colored uniforms because they held power. Nobody was going to stand up to them. But this changed when native soldiers in India rebelled in 1847. In the heat of India, British forces were allowed to wear cool, white cotton clothing for doing chores around the camp. Then when it came time to battle, they did not want to go back to their red wool uniforms in the heat. So they dyed their white work clothes with mazari from a dwarf palm, which came out this drab gray. This was not done to create camouflage. They were trying to make their stained work clothes look more like a real uniform. They just didn't want to go out in the battlefield looking kind of dirty from their chores around camp. Sorry, could we go back one? So this is, where am I? Okay, only a couple of years later, khaki-colored uniforms, that's the Urdu word for dust, became accepted for British soldiers in India. Regiments did the dyeing themselves with all kinds of pigments, tea, coffee, mud, curry powder, etc. Each corps had its own recipe, some of which smelled to high heaven when dyeing was in progress. What do you do to look good, eh? So, This is khaki worn by the 2nd Queen's Battalion in India in 1879. 20 years later, these things take a long time to percolate up from the soldiers to the higher-ups. The British government finally produced real khaki uniforms, but again, they were not intended to be camouflage. That idea hadn't been invented yet, just practical in the heat. They're still wearing those white bands that would make a good target. However, and they knew that, soldiers knew that, when the British fought the Zulus, soldiers dyed their white helmets and belts with whatever they could find: tea, earth, curry powder, and the juice of berries. So it seems the soldiers knew about camouflage. You get a few soldiers hitting the belt, they'll figure it out pretty quickly. This is the popular ivy look in the 1960s when khaki pants became popular. Anybody remember this? Yeah. My dad wore khaki pants, and I thought they were car key pants because he wore them private. So car key. I just learned this morning how to pronounce khaki the right way. Okay, this is the exciting part. Real camouflage began in World War I in France. This is the hard part. When artist and soldier Lucien Victor Girard de Scaevola painted a canvas sheet and threw it over a gun. So immediately he was put in charge of the first military camouflage section. So that happened pretty quickly. There's the camoufleur. The French verb camoufler means to conceal, cover up, disguise, or to blow smoke, generally for illicit purposes. And I think if there's anything that's illicit, it should be war. So here are some real camoufleurs painting the cannon. And Army loves its badges, and here's the camoufleur badge. I think all artists, we should have maybe art badges. Okay, by 1918, 1,200 men and 8,000 women that I think of as camoufleurs worked in Scaevola's camouflage workshops. Scaevola himself was always elegantly dressed in white gloves. Not these. These are actual sniper's gloves that have been painted. They're from 1917, so I assume that they were painted like this for camouflage. But aren't they beautiful? I'm trying to convince you that camouflage, we should look at it differently from war, which is impossible, but to appreciate its beauty. Camouflage is all this, painted by artists. So I appreciate that. It's not what it's used for. This is a cubist sketch of a camouflaged field gun, so I wanted to show you some art. Painted in 1917 by camouflage artist Andre Marr. The camoufleurs only made camouflage to cover stationary objects, guns and stuff, not soldiers, because the deception of camouflage was seen by military traditionalists as cowardice. English officers were skeptical, saying that soldiers wouldn't want to hide from a good fight. And French officers complained about the muddy and glorious color of camouflage. England and Germany followed and raised camouflage sections with artists. The only camouflage that soldiers actually wore in the First World War were helmets, hand-painted by the German soldiers themselves. This is an example of what's called figure disruption, meaning that when you cut a shape up into its parts, it's more difficult to perceive the shape of the whole. Here is figure disruption in nature, a copperhead snake painted by Abbot Thayer, his son Gerald Thayer, and Rockwell Kent. Rockwell Kent actually lived in Newfoundland for a year with his wife and his 3 kids, just loved it. And his house in Brigus is now an artist residency. So if you want to go to Newfoundland, you go to, you have a house to go to. Artist and naturalist Albert H. Thayer is called the father of camouflage, and he's the author of Concealing Coloration in the Animal Kingdom, written in 1909, about how camouflage works in nature. And this is a painting by his son, Gerald Thayer. They worked together, male ruffed grouse in the forest. It took 6 months to paint. Can you see the grouse? Yeah, it's difficult. It's a good argument for camouflage. Another Thayer discovery is countershading, a survival advantage for animals to have light-colored undersides with darker coloring towards the top, because it reverses the usual way we see form with light from above. So it's confusing. As well, sharp contrast between darks and lights works as figure disruption. It distorts the edges of a shape, and that's why it's difficult to see the edges of this bird. Father and son, Abbott and Gerald, collaborated on the use of stencils and cutouts to show how what they call background picturing, or blending in, works in nature. But despite their best efforts demonstrating this throughout Europe and the United States, their ideas were met with skepticism, and even President Roosevelt claimed they were nonsensical and absurd. We learn from the Thayers that camouflage is not simply hiding, it is a collection of strategies used to hide, distract, distort, or blend. It becomes a sort of normalization, of fitting in, and disappearing into what's around you. And humans do this too. We like to fit in with the people around us, with the environment around us, but at the same time, we want to be unique and stand out. We want our privacy, so we're always working with this balance. In 1929, the Italian army issued a camouflage printed cloth. It's the only picture I can find. It's really old, called Tello Mimetico. The first use of printed camouflage fabric that was made expressly for soldiers. A square of this cloth could be a poncho or a shelter. Here are Italian soldiers wearing Tello Mimetico smocks in World War II. And I just found out that they wore these smocks because they had all this stuff on their body that would get caught on branches and things. So you want to have this something smooth around you. Later, in the mid-1960s, Italian artist Elgaro Boatti produced a series of artworks using surplus Tello Mimetico fabric, stretched and framed as art, to draw attention to a pattern that was originally intended to go unnoticed. So he's being kind of clever and ironic. Andy Warhol did the same thing, but Boatti was first. The Tello Mimetico pattern was revived as a camouflage uniform for the Army in 1992, 60 years after it was first invented. They don't let a good pattern go to waste. Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it gorgeous? I mean, who would wear this, except that it's camouflage? Many countries, such as Russia, Germany, the US, and England, copied this pattern. However, the British sold their old uniforms to their former ally, Iraq, in the 1980s. But then they had to fight them in the Gulf War in the 1990s, so they're wearing the same uniform, same pattern. So the British had to switch their pattern quickly. And here's the same pattern, the Tello Mimetico pattern, as fashion. It's a contemporary bag by a Japanese company, Superior Labor. Okay, we're back to camouflage. During World War II, research by the Thayers on background picturing resurfaced in experiments with camouflage in England, as seen here, just like crazy wild stuff, Australia and the US. They even had a unit in New York that would hide in the park and get their pictures taken. Anyway, finally, camouflage for soldiers began to be taken seriously. One of the earliest patterns is the British denizen, and there's an offshoot of this. There's a few of them hanging there, DPM. It's also known as the brushstroke pattern, which you can see. It was actually made by hand with large brushes. So the pattern varied a lot and often had a pinkish color, which I think would be gorgeous. The denizen pattern inspired the French lizard pattern. So camouflage just interbreeds all across the world. It's really hard to follow and make sense of it. And the British lizard camouflage was worn by the French in Vietnam, where it was nicknamed Blood, and you can kind of see why in that picture. These are French lizard sneakers, so now you know what lizard pattern looks like. Kind of like brushstroke. Okay, the French lizard, the lizard pattern wasn't French, it was worn by the French. The lizard pattern was worn a lot in Asia, and it influenced the famous tiger stripe pattern that was worn in Vietnam by the Vietnamese, and the Americans picked it up. And by Dennis Hopper. This is him in Apocalypse Now. Do you love this movie? It's one of my favorite movies. I feel guilty that it's a favorite movie, but yeah, I just love it. Okay, so back to Britain. This is their current camouflage. On the left, it's called DPM, and there's some of it there, and it still has kind of that brushstroke feeling. And this shows this woman's national pride. They won the war. If you lose a war, you're not going to wear the camo, but if you win, yeah, public will pick it up. I find it interesting that some countries with a colonial past wear the same camouflage pattern as their former colonial oppressors. I don't know why. For example, in Kenya, a former British colony, soldiers wear this DPM, this British, it's a version of the British pattern there on the right in beautiful bright colors. And it can work the other way. Insurgent groups in colonized nations were often given camouflage uniforms from countries that wanted the colonizer to be defeated. For example, the Russian camouflage on the left, and you will not believe the name of this camouflage. It's called sun bunnies.
That's way too cute for
It's
camo.
called sun bunnies. It just boggles me, like, where'd that come from?
Because bunnies, when they're really relaxed in the sun, they stretch fully out with their arms and legs and tails. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you. Mystery solved.
I had bunnies. Yeah.
Yeah. And so on the right is East German camo, which was called rice flex in Africa. Everywhere else it's called rain. And it was worn by revolutionaries in the former British colony of Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe and Zambia. And war crime to wear the camouflage pattern of your enemy, for obvious reasons. You can approach the enemy for nefarious purposes. I think I need help. Oh, there we go. Okay. We're in Germany now. This is the palm tree camouflage. And you can see you can find a palm tree in there. Before World War II, Germany started producing a camouflage uniform that was tree-inspired because the Germans see their forest as their spiritual homeland, and they call themselves the forest people. And this palm and mustard pattern shows up on a contemporary yoga mat. Of all things, 100 years later. So pattern just doesn't die, does it? It's, well, good pattern. With good meanings. We want the ones with the bad meanings, and we're coming to those. Yes, we want them to leave. Okay. Like this one. During World War II, the Eichenlaub muster, or oak leaf pattern, was worn by the Waffen SS, who were involved in numerous atrocities. And on the right is a contemporary pillow by the company Habitat. And it's made with the same Eichenlaub muster pattern. Why? Just, it's crazy. And they put pink butterflies in it. That's terrible. It's just so terrible. I have to show you. And so when I talk about what that patterns have meaning, they really do when you look below the surface. This is German Sumpftarn muster, or marsh camouflage on the left. And on the right is a similar pattern worn by soldiers in the past, and sometimes up to the present day, in Libya, Iraq, and Lebanon. Lebanon wore it in the 1980s. I don't think they do anymore. So there's a Nazi reference with this pattern, and it's, I read that it's intentional in their conflicts with Israel. So here we have camouflage used to terrorize. But this is the contemporary pattern worn by German soldiers called the Fluchttarn, or spot. I really like this story. It's based on sunlight falling through the leaves of the linden trees that line the main street in Berlin. And you'll see a few of them in there. And it's a beautiful, beautiful pattern. It's copied a lot, and you can just get that feeling of sunlight through leaves. During World War II, the American frog skin on the left and the German splinter pattern on the right, you'll see a little bit of that rain on top of the splinter pattern, looked very similar. So American soldiers were actually shooting each other because the camouflage patterns were too similar. When American soldiers arrived in Vietnam in 1965, they had no camouflage because they had already supplied the French forces with their World War II uniforms. So the U.S. Army, this is unbelievable. Well, no, I guess not. The U.S. Army ordered commercial duck hunter camouflage from Sears for the American soldiers going to Vietnam. So it is kind of crazy. Yeah, what necessity, I suppose. Finally, the U.S. copied the tiger stripe pattern that was worn by the Vietnam Army, a pattern based on, as we know, the French lizard design. It was restricted to elite units, but regular American soldiers bought them privately in Thailand, which was against the rules. It was man. That was the explanation. So this is what armies do, is they give a new camouflage pattern to the elite units that everybody admires, the parachutists. And once the elite units start wearing this, then all the regular soldiers want to wear the same camouflage. So that's how they draw you in. And in this picture, you can see how those strong horizontal shapes are horizontal on purpose, not vertical, because the horizontal contrast breaks up the verticality of the soldier. There's even a John Wayne pattern. And based on a tiger stripe knockoff he wore in the movie Green Beret. So it's not the real Vietnam tiger stripe. John? His tiger stripes are smaller. So I call him he's a little baby tiger. American soldier is wearing the most popular camouflage in the world, the woodland pattern. He is bent over more like an animal because a soldier in camouflage is both predator and prey. An early advocate of camouflage said that soldiers should act like animals. They should crawl on the ground, they should get down low. But the army thought that was not dignified soldiering, so they didn't really go for that. This woodland camouflage was worn by American soldiers in 2004. So this camouflage was worn for about 30 years, and it's the camouflage in the maternity pants, it's the camouflage in that receiving blanket, although that one is kind of a bastardized copy of, it's not real woodland. But it's so popular, you see it everywhere. But they stopped, the American Army stopped wearing the woodland pattern in 2004 because after that, there was an amazing, important new camouflage never seen before. Canadian digital pattern. We were the first to do this. This is really innovative. We aren't often thought of as an innovative country, but this is a major innovation. It's copied all over the place. It's copied by Americans. You can see the American pattern on the right. That's American. See how unhappy he looks? He's so jealous. The Canadian is like so cool and handsome. So it's called cat pat or relish, if you prefer. So cat pat was created by science using computers. Up until now, all camouflage was made by artists. So now we have camouflage made by computers to match the mathematical value of a landscape's color components. That's what I read. I don't know what it means. So how do you get math from color? I'm asking the artist here. I don't know how they did that. A lot of other countries have created their own version of our digital camouflage, including the Ukrainian army, where women make up 23% of the soldiers, and they let them wear flowers in their hair, and it's only 16% in Canada. There's even cat pat on nails. So we're heading into the last part of my talk about fashion. This is not very fashionable. After the Second World War, camouflage became the unofficial uniform of diverse rebels, taking off into the woods with fantasies of heroism. Fashion theorist Valerie Steele wrote that camouflage gives the wearer membership in an all-male group, supposedly all-male, that condones violence. In the 1960s and 70s, Vietnam War protesters wore army uniforms in a gesture of anti-establishment sarcasm. So camouflage and any military clothing became a symbol of political protest and the counterculture. This is my generation. I remember this. I think this is a great image showing camouflage as protest. The newspaper cutline reads, Soldier Patrick Cloutier and Ojibwe Brad Larocque face off in the tense standoff at Oka, Quebec, which is now better known as the Mohawk Resistance at Kanesatake. This is Robert De Niro as Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver. Military jackets, like the one Robert De Niro was wearing, became punk style in the 1970s. So we think of camouflage now as kind of fashionable and high fashion. You see it on bags, you see it on like cool people wearing camel pants, but it wasn't always like that. So in the 1970s, it was really the outsiders, it was the punks, it was the people on the margins that wore this. Probably because it was really cheap and it was really practical. So this is a vintage punk jacket, an actual one from the 1970s era. Camouflage didn't become high fashion right away. It had to live for a while on the streets. Valerie Steele wrote that fake uniforms, camouflage, confer power upon those who have none, which makes me think of Brad Rock and his camo at Oka and how he didn't have power over his own land. And now, this is GQ, now, 50 years later, it's high fashion. Takes a while. Worn with a tie, no less. While camouflage is designed to hide in nature, it stands out in an urban environment. Paul Virilio wrote that you can imagine that you were in the military, tough and manly, but without the physical and mental damage. Kind of a pointed sentence. This is Lil Kim, hip-hop star, in a camouflage fur coat. Camouflage has a close connection with war and death, which gives this pattern its power, its frisson of sexiness, of power. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not just an empty pattern. It's not just a bunch of colors. It really has underlying, almost unconscious, how we've unconsciously absorbed those meaning from camouflage. It's the same with fur coats, and because fur coats are about killing animals, so when women wear a fur coat as high fashion, not as practical in Winnipeg, I'm telling this to the wrong audience, but there is that connection with death that makes the fur really sexy. I have an article on this if you're interested. I love all this. Studying textiles. So hip-hop stars helped to make all kinds of camouflage patterns popular, especially faux camouflage like this. It's some distance from real camouflage. And I really like how hip-hop fashion messes with the authority of military camouflage. This is Canadian breaking athlete Phil Kim in the Canadian Olympic uniform, which could be a form of faux camouflage. And thank you for Lisa for seeing this. Lisa sent me pictures. Thank you. I agree. It's camo. So the idea of camouflage can also be a useful abstract concept as a way of interpreting the significance of specific strategies of blending, assimilation, invisibility, and masking that can be found in contemporary society as much as they can be found in nature or the military. So that's like a big, broad idea to think about. So my question is, what are the Olympics camouflaging? And of course, there's couture camo. Here's a dress by Jean-Paul Gaultier. Camouflage is dualistic. Whatever is camouflaged is present, but its presence is clouded, distorted, or blended. So again, what is being camouflaged by this dress? And me, I think it's economic disparity. Many soldiers join the army for economic reasons. That's why more Newfoundlanders enlist in the Canadian Armed Forces per capita than any other province. If I'm speaking to any Newfoundlanders, I don't know. And this is my last image. It's a magazine ad I just happened to find in my picture files. It's from a long time ago because not a lot of this work, but much of this work, maybe half of this work was made about 20 years ago when Canada was fighting in Afghanistan. And I was incredibly sad. I mourned and grieved every soldier that died. I had pictures of them in my studio, so that was my motivation. So this is from that era of me being really, really angry. Engineered to take you anywhere? No, engineered to take you to war. So, high to low, from Jean-Paul Gaultier to a guy on the street, camouflage covers it all, hides it all, says me. But it's not just another bold thing to mix in your wardrobe, as Gentleman's Quarterly says. It carries a lot of history and meaning. So I hope you see some of that history and meaning that I've presented this evening. I also want to end with an idea from Virilio, of course, that the presence of camouflage in civilian society shows how war itself is camouflaged among us. So, thank you. I don't know how long that took, but I think we might have a little bit of, does anybody have any questions? Any comments? Any angry statements? Yes.
I'm just wondering how you collected the garments for this piece
Oh.
and the other pieces.
I collected them for many years, and I lived in Newfoundland, and there was this funny little store in Corner Brook that had used army uniforms from who knows where. They also had shoes from Europe. When European designers want to dump their shoes that models wore and that they can't sell, they can't dump them somewhere where people who might buy them would be, so they dump them in Newfoundland. Where we would get the really fancy shoes. But the store also had lots of camouflage, and I traveled in those days. And if I went to New St. John's or I went to Toronto, I would always look for camouflage in the Army Navy stores. And the guys were so nice. The first time I went in, I thought, oh, I'm just this little woman wanting to buy like these Army uniforms. And they would explain to me everything about the uniform and their experience. So I met soldiers that had, this was their job after they came back from Afghanistan. So I collected a lot of those. And then, what is the Gagetown base in New Brunswick? My partner and I were driving by there, and there's an Army Navy store, so I rush in and start buying stuff, and they always say, like, what do you want all this for? Are you starting an army? I was like, oh, I wish. It would be a peaceful army. Anyway, those are my dreams. And he said, and I said, I cut them up, and which makes some of the people in these stores faint. And he said, would you like some uniforms I've never been able to sell? And I said, sure. And he had 20 boxes of Canadian uniforms that were worn in Bosnia. The fabric was so crappy, they were split, they were thin. There's no way you could sell them. And you can usually sell a camouflage thing like with tears and stuff because people want it. So a lot of the plain, solid colored green in that piece. If you feel the fabric, and you have my permission, you have permission to gently feel this work. If you feel the fabric, you'll feel how thin it is. So it just upsets me as a Canadian. I feel that fabric, and then I go feel something from Belgium. It's really thick, and it's cotton, it's not polyester, it's going to breathe, and beautiful colors. So anyway, and then I got a Canada Council grant and to go to Berlin and London to buy camouflage fabric. So there's some really old ones there from World War II. That's, I think, as far back as I have. And that was the guy in the store. Like, I thought he was going to throw me out of the store, and I said, well, what do you do with them? I said, I cut them up. He was like, wow. But they were really expensive. But it was like your taxpayer money, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where they come from. I'll collect more. One of them, there's one American uniform in there that belongs to the neighbor of a friend of mine who lives in Rochester, New York. And she was telling her neighbor about the work I'm doing, and her neighbor said, my husband is right now, I don't know what conflict it was, but she was worried about it. And she said, if I send you one of his uniforms, maybe that would be some kind of magic that will protect him. And Before I did this talk, I thought I better find out if he's still alive, but I haven't heard yet back from my friends, so I'll let you know. Hope so, yeah.
Were you here in the 80s? Were you around in the 80s?
Yes, I was,
Did you go to the Army and Navy at Portage, Maine?
all the time.
Yeah, I got boots from there.
Yeah, it was before I started doing all this work, but I remember seeing the ghillie suits and thinking, that's art. And ghillie suits are those big suits that you wear like to hunt or to be a sniper that are just full of all kinds of stuff. So it's, you look like a monster. Yeah.
Do you know anything about the artists or the designers that were hired to do these patterns?
No, just what I told you about the French ones from First World War. I need a big grant and I need to go back to academia and get a grant and have some researchers help me. I think it'd be really difficult to find them, and a lot of them wouldn't be alive anymore. I mean, in terms of the beautiful World War II ones. But what would be really interesting would be to go to some countries that like Kenya, that have these amazing, beautiful ones, and go collect these. I'd love to, if I was rich and could fly, which I can't, but to collect these. A camouflage collector, a peacenik is a camouflage collector.
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you feel that, this work is from 20 years ago right up to today? Do you feel that you've said everything you want to say about war, or do you have more to say that might produce another body of work?
I have more to say kind of along these lines, and we'll always have more to say about war until war goes away, because it hurts me so much. And there's no words for it. It's absolutely, totally insane. I don't think it should be called war. I think it should be called murdering, because it is murdering. I mean, if you murder somebody, you go to jail. So why do we put up with this? And so, yes, I have a lot to learn, but it's very difficult work to do. So I'd like to do more. I have lots more ideas. Well, as artists we do, they just roll out of us. Yeah. Thanks. Hi.
Can you talk about the flowers here on the wall?
Oh gosh. They are kind of embarrassing.
Can we pick another piece?
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'll tell you the truth. The truth is that I just don't like the hippies. You guys already know this, don't you? Even though I was one, like kind of weekend, and I still am. I still have big parts of myself that are like hippie-ish. And I think, the era that we grew up in, that we matured in, has an influence on us forever. But, so there were this kind of hippie thing that you would go, and there's a picture of a guy going up to the National Guards at a Vietnam protest in early 70s maybe, and he's putting a daisy into the barrel of a National Guardsman's gun. Like, that's gonna stop war? Just so stupid. So, I'm embarrassed to be saying this in front of, like, people. But who knows where art comes from. I think there's maybe a little bit more to it than this. Well, when I made them, I kind of shocked myself because I thought, oh, they're bullet holes. They're also bullet holes with the splaying of the human fragility all around them. So they mean that too. So they're falling. I see them as falling humans in war, which is what the Willow Leaf is about. It's about the loss of human life in war. So I see it in a few different ways. Sorry.
So, can you tell me about, they look like parts of ghillie suits, the draping there?
Oh, I like that reference. I hadn't thought of that before. Yes, they are a bit like the strands that hang down from the ghillie suit.
Yeah.
They're starting to rethink the ghillie suit for high-tech soldiering because there's a, I don't understand all this stuff, but you can see somebody with their heat signature through technology. They're kind of red. So they know that if you can spread the heat out to the outer edges of the body. So a ghillie suit does that. So it disperses the heat from the human body so you can be hidden a little bit better from them. But what this is the real name of it is fringe, and it's what you see in used car lots. So yeah, so this is my really sick kind of welcome to the show. That's about it. It's like, come on in, or it's like a terrible enticement to young people. Yeah, come on in, there's a war. I just hate talking about this when there's a war going on right now. I'm so disturbed by the way I'm talking about my work. So this is that horrible balance I have with my work. Like on one hand, I have this sort of sick, black, terrible humor. Humor isn't even the right word, sort of terrible thoughts, you know? And on the other hand, I'm just feeling such human pain and empathy for people caught up in war, which I could never understand. You know my experience with war from the beginning of the talk. It's all second, third hand. So it is very difficult. And with this work, I'm on that teeter-totter balance between kind of a ridiculous and serious, and some of the newer pieces like the receiving blanket and the little slippers. I'm interested in work that you almost could find in Walmart. You know that, little camel slippers, somebody might buy them for their kids. Whereas me, I think that's the worst thing you can do with a baby is put them in camouflage. Like, just like, no, you don't want to even think about that with babies. Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I mean? Mothers, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? Yes.
So these pieces, were they also like a slant to the flower power, like the cookies?
Just a little bit, just in my own experience. It's also about just flowers. People have been telling me these really nice references, like how you bring flowers to a grave and then they die at the grave. So what is that about? You know, it's kind of, and the life of a flower is so short. But it is a nice metaphor for our lives too, to perhaps contemplate. So these are flowers on their way down to the earth, where we will all end up.
I told my husband he was going in the backyard.
Can I go there too? I'm looking for a green burial if anybody wants a place.
There's a company in Edmonton, I think that
There's a two in Winnipeg. There's a group in Winnipeg that's working on acquiring land. Yeah.
So I have some cousins here, so now they know what to do with my body.
We have video evidence also of it.
Video evidence.
For some strange reason, a couple years ago, I was in Valley Village, and I saw a pair of blue camouflage capris that I bought, and I just could never wear them. I'd put them on, and I'd be like, I can go out and help it. I couldn't even go out in the backyard. And I think being here tonight, now I fully realize why. It's sort of that subconscious sort of thing about camouflage.
Yeah.
That just, even if it's blue.
Yeah. Yes.
It's like, it's just kind of odd.
It is. We don't have the right word for it, do we?
No.
I can see you kind of looking for the right word. We we don't have the right word for that.
So they're in a bag, ready to be shipped off to who knows where now.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just,
I don't know anywhere in the world where you could wear camouflage without it having that war meaning. It's like artists like to say there's no such thing as universal, but there's one or two things that are universal, but that's almost universal.
and capris.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Barb,
They are nice patterns.
Barb, part of what I'm thinking about now in response to this, and remembering, you know, your work of the knitted and, you know, grenade, you know, the all that arm and stuff, and I remember seeing some of those. That's, you know, I'm remembering back, you know, over 20 years that I saw some, and but like they, you know, they were pink. And I mean, and I know there was, you know, choices around that, but I guess I'm processing, you know, memories of that in response to, you know, this work and what you were just presenting. So I guess I'm, you know, so I'm curious about, what just makes me curious about color and how that affects. I mean, not about your choices of color in that, but I think just generally, I mean, how color, you know, how color influences some of this, or also, yeah, anyhow.
Well,
There's no question there, it's just, yeah, I'm just remembering that work and wanting to bring it into the context of this.
there is a bridge
Yeah.
between the pink knitted landmines and this work. And it's a piece I made for Ricky Hillmayer. And I started embroidering a chain stitch. I got an American uniform, pants and shirt in the common woodland pattern. And I embroidered with different shades of pink all around each of those shapes. It took like months, maybe 2 years, I can't remember, a long time. 2003, 2004, I think. And so the pink in that, and I saw those shapes of camouflage as borders
Right.
Yeah.
because there are two colors and there's like a border between them. So I was doing the chain stitch all along these borders, trying to keep the armies from these two different colors from hurting each other. And it was a piece of magic to keep Ricky Hillmayer safe in the past. I knew he was safe when I did this. I called him when I was in my 30s. We were like 14 or 15. That was his brother's motorcycle, wasn't his. These were like just kids. But that was the pink, that pink was the bridge into working with camouflage. So once I had this piece done with camouflage, and then Canadian soldiers started dying in Afghanistan, and so I kept working with camouflage because it was a way for me, it was a medium for me to express my grief. And this show is kind of dark, and I realized that there's not too many pieces in here because if I put in more work, it would be a little too dark. So I like having the space be kind of open. Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on, like, with this particular role of a designer in, you know, creating fashion? Should they have a social responsibility to understand the history and the complexities of what they're delivering?
Absolutely. I think every human in the world has a responsibility to understand what's around them and what it means. I don't know about the rest of the world, but I know in Canada we don't have an adequate art education in the schools. So that's to think critically and to look at pattern critically, to look at art critically. It helps you to look at the world critically. So yes, and especially, as you know, I was a pattern designer and painter. So sometimes I painted other people's, and sometimes they asked me can you come up with a pattern of people skiing? And I was like, yeah, sure. they paid me $300, like in 1995, for a little painting this big in gouache. $300. Sheila Butler came to visit me and she said, "You get $300 for that?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "I don't get that much." She was kind of jealous.
And then that little painting was reproduced and patterned
Yes,
out.
so that would be, that would be made into a repeat. So I learned how to do repeats and print it onto fabric. So it was pretty cool because once in a while in Montreal, I would see one of my patterns, somebody wearing it. I even saw somebody in Newfoundland wearing the skiing pattern. And they took a picture and I said, "I did that pattern." I was so proud of it. But what I wanted to say was that one day I was working for one company, so I was sort of freelance and also sort of working for different companies, and one company wanted me to do a pattern that was stereotypes of ethnic, so-called ethnic. They want a little Mexican with a Mexican hat, and I was like, "No, you can't do that. You just can't do that." And they actually listened to me and said, "Yeah, you're right. It's kind of dumb." Yeah, so that's one example. Although being a single woman without children, it's easy for me to stand up to a boss. It may not be easy for everyone to do that in their job. They didn't fire me. Well, not then.
Thank you so much,
That's
Barb. That was
awesome.
such a great talk.